I am sorry, Your Grace. There is nothing more I can do for the boy. The words hung in the oppressive silence of the Duke of Blackwood's grand study. They were an echo of 100 other failed consultations, 100 other platitudes dressed in the sober clothes of medical expertise. Dr. Hemlock, a man whose reputation was as polished as the gleaming mahogany desk between them, looked down at his hands, defeated. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke, did not move. He stood by the tall window, his back to the doctor, his gaze fixed on the manicured lawns rolling away into the autumn mist. The rain had been relentless for days, turning the world a uniform, weeping grey. It suited his mood. It had suited his mood for 5 years. Nothing, Alistair repeated. The word was not a question. It was a flat, dead thing. You are the finest physician in London. You came with the highest recommendations, and you have nothing. It is not a malady of the body, Your Grace, the doctor said, his voice soft, cautious. The boy's leg has healed perfectly. The lingering terror, this phobia, it is a sickness of the mind, of the spirit. I am a man of science, of flesh and bone. I cannot mend a fractured soul. Alistair's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The leather of his gloves creaked in protest. A fractured soul. He knew something of that. His own was a ruin, a collapsed cathedral where faith and love had once resided. He screams if a horse so much as passes on the road, Alistair stated, the control in his voice a thin sheet of ice over a raging sea. My son, the heir to the Blackwood dukedom, he cannot bear the sight of the very animal that is the symbol of our station. He is 7 years old and weeps like an infant. The trauma was severe. It was a fall, Alistair snapped, turning from the window at last. His face was a mask of cold fury, his grey eyes chips of granite. Boys fall from ponies every day. They get back on. They do not turn into quivering neurotics. The doctor wisely said nothing. He had heard the details of the accident. The young Lord Thomas had been riding with his uncle, Lord Frederick Beaumont. The pony, a placid creature known for its gentle nature, had inexplicably bolted, throwing the boy into the stone wall of the paddock. Frederick had been a hero, catching the beast, rushing to the child's side. But the damage was done. Not to the boy's bones, but to something far deeper. There is one last resort, Dr. Hemlock offered, gathering his bag. I heard it from a colleague who treats the rural gentry. There are people in the countryside, so-called whisperers. They have a way with animals, and sometimes with the people frightened of them. It is not science. It is folklore. But at this stage, what is there to lose? Folklore. Witchcraft. Alistair's lip curled. He was a man of logic, of ledgers and law. But he was also a man of desperation. He looked past the doctor, his gaze catching on the portrait above the cold fireplace. Her, Alara. Her smile in the painting was a daily torment. It was a ghost of a life he had murdered with his own pride and foolishness 5 years ago. She had looked at him with those same vibrant, trusting eyes before he had cast her out, waving a forged letter in her face like a righteous sword. He had called her a whore. He had told her he never wanted to see her again. And he never had. Her carriage had crashed on the road to Dover. They found the wreckage, the splintered wood, and the dead horses. They found a body, burned beyond recognition, wearing her cloak. They had never found the sapphires he had given her. The thief who caused the crash had taken them, they said. He had believed it all. He had wallowed in his righteous, self-inflicted misery. He had let his cousin Frederick, the man who had so helpfully uncovered the affair, become his shadow, his confidant, his poison. Now, all he had left of his marriage was a son who was afraid of the world and a portrait of a woman he had destroyed. Where is this person? Alistair asked, his voice rough. A small village, in the northernmost part of your own duchy, ironically, a place called Oakhaven. They say it is a woman. They call her Ellie. The journey was a descent. Alistair left the polished comfort of Blackwood Manor behind, the carriage wheels sinking into muddy tracks that were little more than suggestions of a road. He took only his son, Thomas, and a single grim-faced valet. The boy was pale and silent for the entire trip, his small hand clutching a worn silver locket that never left his person. He had clutched it for 5 years. Alistair knew it had been a gift from his mother, another shard of guilt in the mosaic of his regret. Oakhaven was less a village and more a collection of stone cottages huddled together against the wind. It smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and livestock, a raw, honest smell so different from the cloying perfumes and floor polish of his life. The stable was at the edge of the hamlet, a low, slate-roofed building with a paddock of churned mud beside it. Alistair left Thomas in the carriage, the boy's eyes wide with apprehension at the distant whinny of a horse. He stepped out, the damp air clinging to his fine woolen coat. He felt like a creature from another planet. A woman was in the paddock, calming a large grey mare that was tossing its head nervously. She was not what he had expected. There was no crone, no wild-eyed mystic. This woman was tall and slender, dressed in practical men's trousers and a thick, darned sweater. Her hair was the color of rich, dark honey, braided down her back and escaping in wisps around a face that was weathered by sun and wind. Her hands, as she stroked the mare's neck, were capable and sure. She murmured to the horse, her voice a low, soothing melody that the wind almost stole. The mare's ears swiveled, its trembling lessened. The woman's focus was absolute. Alistair walked towards the fence, his boots sinking into the soft ground. "I'm looking for someone called Ellie," he called out. The woman did not turn immediately. She gave the mare a final, reassuring pat on the neck before facing him. And the world stopped. The air left Alistair's lungs in a silent rush. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner. It was not possible. It was a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by his guilt-ridden mind. But the face, though leaner and marked by a life he could not imagine, was unmistakable. The high cheekbones, the stubborn set of her chin, and the eyes. Dear God, the eyes. They were the same shade of deep forest green, but the trust he remembered was gone. In its place was a hard, guarded weariness, and as they locked on him, that weariness flared into pure, unadulterated shock. "Ilara," he breathed. The name was a prayer and a curse on his tongue. She froze. Every line of her body went rigid. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of old parchment. For a heart-stopping second, he thought she would faint, but she did not. Her spine straightened, and something inside her seemed to solidify, turning from shocked flesh to unyielding stone. She said nothing. She simply stared, her green eyes wide with a terrifying mix of disbelief and a hatred so profound it was like a physical blow. "It cannot be," he whispered, taking a step towards the fence. His movement broke the spell. "Stay back," she commanded. Her voice was different. Lower, rougher, stripped of the gentle cadence he remembered. This was the voice of a woman who gave orders and expected them to be obeyed. "Ilara, I thought you were dead." The words were inadequate. They were pebbles thrown against a fortress wall. "A convenient thought for you, I imagine," she shot back, her voice dripping with an acid bitterness that burned him. From the carriage, a small, frightened cry broke the tension. "Father?" Ilara's gaze flickered towards the sound. Her eyes narrowed, focusing on the carriage door where the valet was now helping a small boy descend. She saw the pale, delicate face, the dark hair, and the wide, frightened gray eyes. Her eyes, but his father's. Her breath hitched. The stony facade of her anger cracked, and for a fleeting moment, a look of such profound, wrenching agony crossed her face that Alistair felt his own heart break anew. Thomas, her little boy. He had been just a toddler, all babbling words and clumsy steps. Now he was a person, a small, fragile person who was staring at the mare in the paddock with an expression of sheer terror. She tore her gaze from the boy, forcing it back to Alistair. The agony vanished, replaced by a glacial fury. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. "What do you want?" "My son," Alistair began, his mind reeling, trying to process the impossible reality of her standing before him, alive. "He is afraid of horses. There was an accident. They said a woman here could help." The irony was so cruel, so grotesquely perfect that Ilara almost laughed. It was a harsh, brittle sound that died in her throat. He had brought his son, their son, to her. The mother he had cast out, to cure the boy of a fear she had not been there to prevent. "Get out," she said, her voice flat and empty. "Please," he said, and the word shocked him. He, the Duke of Blackwood, did not plead. But he was not a duke right now. He was a man staring at the ghost he had created, and she was real, and she hated him. "Ilara, please, I need to understand. What happened?" "You want to understand?" she asked, and this time she did laugh, a short, sharp bark devoid of humor. "You who understood nothing, you who believed a lie whispered by a snake and condemned your wife without a second thought, you have no right to understand anything." She turned her back on him, walking back towards the mare, her movements stiff with rage. Take your son and leave Oakhaven. There is no one here for you. I will not leave, Alistair said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old authority, born of desperation now, not pride. Not now, not until you talk to me. She stopped, her back still to him. There is nothing to say. You made your choice 5 years ago, Your Grace. The use of his title was a slap. It was a wall of ice erected between them, a reminder of the chasm he had blasted into their lives. He watched her, this stranger who was his wife, her shoulders set against him, a portrait of defiance. He looked from her to his son, who was now hiding behind the valet, peeking out with terrified eyes. A fracture of the soul, the doctor had said. He was looking at two, and he was the cause of both. No, he would not leave. Not this time. He did not argue further. He simply instructed his valet to find them lodgings in the village. The best the dreary place had to offer was a set of rooms above the public house, rooms that smelled of stale ale and wood smoke. They were clean, but humble to a degree that was utterly foreign to Alistair. He sent the valet and the carriage back to Blackwood Manor, keeping only a single saddle horse for himself, which he stabled at the opposite end of the village. He would not force the sight of it on his son or on her. He was severing his line of retreat. He was stranding himself here, in this damp, forgotten corner of his own world. The next morning he walked back to the stables. He did not approach her. He simply stood by the paddock fence, a silent, solitary figure in the morning mist. She was there, mucking out a stall, her movements efficient and strong. She wore the same practical trousers, her braids swinging as she worked. She ignored him completely. She acted as if he were a tree or a rock, a feature of the landscape not worthy of notice. Thomas remained in their rooms, cared for by the innkeeper's wife, a stout woman with kind eyes. The boy would not venture out. He had heard the horses. For 3 days, this was their routine. Alistair would stand at the fence, watching. She would work, ignoring him. The silence between them was vast and heavy, filled with unspoken accusations and years of pain. He saw the villagers greet her. They called her Ellie. They treated her with a casual respect, a warmth reserved for one of their own. She smiled at them. The smile was a small, guarded thing, nothing like the radiant joy in the portrait that haunted him, but it was genuine, and it was not for him. He learned she lived in a tiny cottage adjoining the stables, a place that was little more than a single room with a loft. He saw the smoke from its chimney in the evenings. He imagined her inside, alone, and the guilt was a physical weight in his chest. What had her life been? He had sentenced her to death in his mind, a tragic, dramatic end. The reality was so much harder, so much crueler. She had survived. She had scraped by, shedding her name, her status, her entire identity. She had become this tough, solitary woman, while he had remained in his gilded cage, nursing his hollow grief. On the 4th day, he broke the silence. "The crash," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. "On the Dover Road, they found a body." She did not stop her work, but her shoulders tightened. "A poor woman," she said, her voice tight. "A vagrant who had stolen my cloak and jewels from the inn where I stopped. The thieves who caused the crash took her life along with my things. I was already gone by then. I read about it in a newspaper a week later. Duchess of Blackwood perishes in fiery wreck. It was a very neat ending for you." He flinched. "I sent men to find you. Before that, I regretted it, almost immediately." It was a lie. Regret had been a slow-growing cancer, not a sudden revelation, but he needed her to believe it. She finally stopped, leaning the pitchfork against the stable wall. She turned to face him, her arms crossed over her chest. "Did you, or did your cousin Frederick convince you that a grieving widower was a more sympathetic figure than a cuckolded husband?" Her words were scalpels, expertly dissecting his weakness, his reliance on the man who had orchestrated their ruin. "I was a fool," he said, the admission costing his pride more than anything he had ever paid. "I was blind. He showed me a letter. A letter I never wrote," she finished for him, "to a man I had never met. Did it not occur to you to ask me? To trust the woman you had married, the mother of your son?" "I was proud," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Arrogant. He played on my fears, my insecurities. He played on your weakness," she corrected him coldly. "And you let him. You always let him." She gestured vaguely towards the village. "Now you have brought your son, our son, to my doorstep. What do you expect me to do? Wave a magic wand and fix the damage you allowed to happen?" "I expect nothing," Alistair said, his voice raw. "I am asking. I am begging, not for me, for him. He is a ghost. Elara. He is terrified of his own shadow. I have failed him. In every way a father can fail a son. Perhaps you can succeed where I have failed. Her gaze softened for a fraction of a second as she thought of the boy, the small, pale face. Her heart ached with a fierce, protective love that had been buried under layers of anger and grief for 5 long years. She had mourned him as if he were dead, for he was just as lost to her, and now he was here, broken. She looked at Alistair, at the desperation etched on his proud face, the exhaustion in his eyes. She saw not the powerful duke, but a man brought to his knees. It gave her no satisfaction, only a deep, bone-weary sadness. 1 week, she said, her voice clipped and businesslike. I will try, for the boy's sake only, not for you. You will stay away from the stables while I am with him. You will not interfere. You will not speak to me unless I speak to you first. At the end of the week you will pay me for my time and you will leave. Are those terms acceptable, Your Grace? He nodded, relief and pain warring within him. They are. The next morning she went to the inn. She found Thomas in the sitting room, huddled by the fire, a book unread in his lap. The innkeeper's wife curtsied and left them alone. Ilara knelt, bringing herself down to his level. He flinched, his grey eyes wide and wary. He looked so much like Alistair, but there was a fragility in him that his father had never possessed. Hello, she said softly. My name is Ellie. He just stared, clutching the silver locket that hung around his neck. She recognized it instantly, her heart constricted. She had put it there herself, the day before she had fled, whispering a promise into his baby-fine hair that she would come back for him. A promise she had been unable to keep. I hear you are not very fond of horses, she continued, keeping her voice gentle. He shook his head, his lower lip trembling. They are monsters. Sometimes they can be, she agreed, surprising him. They are very big, and they can be frightened just like people, and when they are frightened they do foolish things. The pony, Pip. He tried to kill me, Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. No, Ilara said with quiet certainty. Pip did not try to kill you. He was scared. Something scared him very badly. It was not his fault, and it was not your fault. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. No one had ever told him it was not his fault. He had been carrying the blame, the shame of his fear, like a heavy cloak. I work with horses, she said. I teach them not to be scared, and sometimes I teach people not to be scared of them. Would you like to see how I do it? We do not have to go near any of the big horses. There is someone very small I would like you to meet. He hesitated, his gaze darting towards the window as if a monstrous horse might burst through it at any moment. But her voice was calm. It was a safe harbor in his sea of fear. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She did not take him to the main stable. She led him around the back to a small, sheltered enclosure where a tiny pony stood. It was a Shetland, no taller than a large dog, with a shaggy, cream-colored coat and a gentle, curious expression. Thomas stopped dead, his body tensing. This is Daisy, Ilara said, not moving any closer. She is very old. Her favorite things to do are eat peppermints and stand in the sun. Ilara did not force him. She simply sat on an upturned bucket a safe distance away and began to groom Daisy, talking to the pony in a low, soothing murmur. She spoke of the weather, of the birds in the rafters, of nothing and everything. She did not look at Thomas, but she was aware of his every breath. For an hour he stood by the fence, watching. He saw that the tiny pony did nothing but swish its tail and occasionally nuzzle Ilara's pocket, searching for a treat. It did not rear, it did not bolt, it did not look like a monster. The next day, she brought a stool for him and placed it just inside the enclosure gate. He sat there for a long time before finally gathering the courage to place his feet on the ground on the other side. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Alistair watched from a distance, hidden by a copse of trees at the edge of the woods. He saw her patience, her profound, innate gentleness. He saw the way she never pushed, never forced, simply created a space of such safety that the boy could not help but take a tentative step into it. It was a skill, a gift that he had never possessed. He was a man of commands, of outcomes. She was a woman of process, of patience. He also used the time to begin his own work. He wrote a letter to his solicitor in London, a man of unimpeachable discretion. He did not use the post. He paid a local boy handsomely to ride to the next town and hire a special courier. He asked for a quiet investigation into his cousin, Lord Frederick Beaumont. He wanted to know everything. His finances, his associates, his movements over the past 5 years, and specifically his whereabouts on the day of Thomas's riding accident. He also began to re-examine the past in his own mind. He dredged up the memory of that terrible day, Frederick arriving, his face a mask of sorrow and concern. the letter he presented. Alistair remembered the handwriting. It had looked like Ilara's, but now, thinking back, was it not just a little too perfect, too practiced? Ilara's handwriting had always been a little rushed, a little slanted, full of life and impatience. The script in that letter had been cold, precise. And the man she was supposedly meeting, a minor baron he had never even heard of. Frederick had claimed to have seen them, to have overheard their plans. Alistair had been so consumed by the poison of jealousy that he had never once questioned the source. He had trusted his cousin implicitly, the cousin who stood to gain so much if Alistair's line were to fail. The thought was so vile, so monstrous, that he felt sick. He had not just been a fool, he had been a willing pawn in a game he hadn't even known was being played. He had sacrificed his wife and his own happiness on the altar of his cousin's ambition. By the 5th day, Thomas was sitting on the ground next to Ilara, tentatively stroking Daisy's soft nose. The pony lipped at his palm, and the boy giggled, a sound so rare and precious it was like a jewel. "She tickles," he said, looking up at Ilara, his grey eyes shining. "She is looking for peppermints," Ilara said, her heart aching with a love so fierce it almost buckled her. This was her son, her clever, brave, beautiful boy, and he was healing. On the 6th day, she brought a small, soft brush. "Horses love to be brushed," she explained. "It makes them feel safe and cared for." She showed him how, using long, gentle strokes. After a while, she offered the brush to him. He took it, his hand trembling slightly. He reached out and touched it to Daisy's shaggy flank. He mimicked her movements, his strokes clumsy at first, then more confident. A small smile played on his lips. He was not just touching the horse, he was caring for it. He was the one in control, the one providing comfort. The dynamic of fear was shifting. That evening, Alistair approached the stables after Thomas was back at the inn. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose. Ilara was leaning against the paddock fence, staring out at the horizon, a solitary figure wrapped in the twilight. "He smiled today," Alistair said softly, stopping a respectful distance away. "I heard him laugh." She did not look at him. "He is a brave boy. He gets that from his mother," he said. She turned then, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "Does he? I was not brave. I ran." "You survived," he corrected her. "That is the most profound kind of bravery there is. I stayed, and I did nothing but rot." The silence stretched between them again, but this time it was different. It was less a wall and more a space, a quiet field where something new might have room to grow. "Why," she asked, her voice barely a whisper, "why did you hate me so much that you would believe it?" The question was one he had asked himself 1,000 times in the dead of night. "I did not hate you," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. I think I was terrified of how much I loved you. It was a feeling so immense, so far beyond my control. I had spent my entire life controlling everything, my estate, my finances, my emotions. And then there was you. You were not controllable. You were a force of nature. Loving you felt like standing on a cliff edge. And when Frederick told me you had betrayed me, it was almost a relief. It was a reason to step back from the edge. It was an excuse to return to the cold, safe numbness I had always known. It was the act of a coward. It was the most honest thing he had ever said. The truth of it stripped him bare, leaving him exposed and defenseless before her. She stared at him for a long time, her green eyes searching his face. She saw no ducal pride, no arrogance. She saw only a man drowning in regret. "Tomorrow is the last day," she said, her voice quiet. "The end of our agreement." He nodded, his heart sinking. "I know. Bring him to the stables in the morning," she said. "Both of you." The next morning, Alistair walked with Thomas to the stables. The boy's hand was not clutching his. It was swinging freely by his side. When they entered the yard, Thomas did not flinch at the sight of the larger horses in their stalls. His gaze went straight to the enclosure where Daisy was waiting. Ilara was there. She was not holding a brush, but a small, worn, leather saddle. "Good morning, Thomas," she said with a gentle smile. "Daisy told me she would very much like to go for a short walk today, but her old legs get tired. She was wondering if you might be willing to ride her, just to help her along." Thomas looked at the tiny saddle. He looked at the placid pony. He looked at Ilara's calm, trusting face. Then he looked at his father. Alistair held his breath. He gave his son a small, encouraging nod. "All right," Thomas said, his voice small but firm. Alistair's heart soared. He watched as Alara, with infinite patience, showed Thomas how to approach the pony, how to speak to her, how to place a foot in the stirrup. Alistair did not help. He was merely a spectator. This was their moment. Ilara lifted the boy easily and settled him into the saddle. Thomas's small hands gripped the front of it, his knuckles white. Ilara did not let go. She kept one hand on his leg, a point of constant reassuring contact. With her other hand, she took the pony's lead rope. "Ready?" she asked softly. Thomas nodded, his eyes fixed on the pony's ears. Slowly, she began to walk, leading the pony in a small circle around the enclosure. Alistair watched his son, the boy who had been paralyzed by fear, sit tall atop the pony. His face was a mask of intense concentration, but there was no terror in it. There was only focus and a dawning sense of wonder. They circled the enclosure once, twice. On the third time, a small, tentative smile touched Thomas's lips. He had done it. He was riding. The monster was just a pony, and he was its master. When they stopped, Ilara lifted him down. Thomas threw his arms around her waist, burying his face in her rough sweater. "Thank you, Ellie," he mumbled. Ilara froze, her arms hovering for a moment before they came down to encircle the boy in a fierce, protective hug. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of his hair. 5 years she had dreamed of this, of holding her son. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sharp. Alistair watched, his own vision blurring. He had been given a glimpse of the family he had thrown away, and the sight was both beautiful and agonizing. Later that day, a courier arrived from London. He found the Duke at the inn. The packet of documents was thick. Alistair opened it, his hands unsteady. It was all there. His solicitor had been ruthlessly efficient. Frederick's finances were a disaster. He was drowning in gambling debts. He had been systematically selling off assets from a small, unentailed estate Alistair had given him years ago. There were statements from witnesses, stable hands at Blackwood Manor. One of them confessed that Lord Frederick had paid him to put a burr under the saddle of Thomas's pony on the day of the accident. He described how Frederick had made a great show of calming the panicked animal after the boy was thrown. The final document was a report from a handwriting expert. He had analyzed the forged letter Alistair had kept locked away, comparing it to samples of Ilara's correspondence. The conclusion was unequivocal. The letter was a masterful but definite forgery. The proof was absolute. The betrayal was complete. Alistair did not rage. The fury was a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He sat for a long time, the papers spread before him, a testament to his own monumental stupidity. He had been so easily led, so eager to believe the worst. His pride had been the weapon, but Frederick had been the one to wield it. He gathered the papers. He walked to the stables. The sun was low, the air crisp with the promise of a cold night. Ilara was rubbing down a chestnut gelding, her movements rhythmic and sure. She saw him approach and her body tensed, her hand stilling on the horse's flank. "The week is over," she said, her voice wary. "I assume you have come to pay me and collect your son?" "I have," he said, his voice quiet. He stopped in front of her and held out the sheaf of papers. "But first, I want you to read these." She looked from the papers to his face. His expression was grim, his eyes filled with a dark, chilling resolve. Hesitantly, she wiped her hands on a rag and took the documents. She stood there in the fading light of the stable yard, reading. She read the financial statements. She read the stable hand's confession. She read the handwriting expert's damning report. As she read, the rigid control she maintained over her emotions began to crumble. Her hands started to shake. A dry sob escaped her throat. It was one thing to know, in her heart, that she had been framed. It was another to see the cold, calculated mechanics of the betrayal laid bare on paper. The cruelty of it, the sheer, reptilian coldness of Frederick's plan was staggering. And the accident, Thomas's accident. It had not been an accident at all. It had been a deliberate act of violence against a child. She looked up at Alistair, her face ashen, her green eyes blazing with a mixture of horror and righteous fury. "He hurt him," she whispered. "That monster, he hurt our son, on purpose." "Yes," Alistair said, his voice like stone. "And I let him. I stood by and let him comfort me for the grief he had caused. I let him get close to my son, our son." He took a step closer, his own control finally breaking. "Ilara, what I did to you was unforgivable. It was born of pride and weakness, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for it. But what he did to that little boy, that is a crime that demands justice." He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to steady himself. I am going back to Blackwood. I'm going to face him, and I'm going to destroy him. Not with a jewel, that would be too honorable for him. I'm going to ruin him, publicly and completely. I will use the law, and I will use his own debts. And I will strip him of his name and his standing until he has nothing left but his own miserable existence. He paused, his gaze intense. But I will not do it without you, and I will not take Thomas away from you again. I am asking you to come with me, not as my duchess, not as my wife unless you should ever choose to be again, but as his mother. He needs you, and I need you. The raw vulnerability in his voice was something she had never heard before. He was not commanding, he was not demanding, he was broken, and he was asking for her help to piece himself back together. She looked from his shattered face to the papers in her hand. She thought of Thomas, of his laughter as he sat on the pony, of the way he had hugged her. She had built a life here, a hard, simple, safe life. To return to Blackwood was to return to a world of lies and hypocrisy, of judgment and pain. But her son was there, and for the first time in 5 years, his father was truly there too. The arrogant duke was gone, replaced by this humbled, determined man, a man who was finally ready to fight for his family. He will not see it coming, she said, her voice low and filled with a cold fire that matched his own. Frederick, he thinks you are weak, he thinks you are still his puppet. He is about to be very surprised, Alistair said. We will need to be clever, she continued, her mind already working, the sharp, strategic intelligence she had been forced to suppress for so long coming back to life. A public accusation is one thing, a perfectly executed social annihilation is another. Alistair saw the change in her, the warrior queen emerging from behind the stable girl's quiet facade. A slow smile, the first genuine smile he had felt in years, touched his lips. I am open to suggestions, my lady. The use of the endearment was soft, tentative. It was not a presumption of his rights, but a memory of what they had lost. She did not correct him. She simply nodded, her hand tightening on the evidence that would be their weapon. First, she said, her voice all business now, you will go back alone. You will tell everyone that the horse whisperer was a fraud. You will act defeated. You will let Frederick think he has won, that your son is a lost cause. And you? He asked. I will follow in a few days, not as the Duchess of Blackwood. I will arrive as Ellie, the stable girl you hired out of pity to care for the horses your son can no longer ride. I will be beneath notice, and from the servants' halls I will watch, and I will listen. A duchess hears only flattery. A stable girl hears everything. It was a brilliant, dangerous plan, and it was pure Elara. They returned to Blackwood Manor not as a united family, but as a conspiracy. Alistair played his part to perfection. He was morose, defeated, leaning on his cousin for support more than ever. Frederick was smug, his condolences for the failed trip to Oakhaven dripping with false sympathy. He saw Alistair's despair as a sign of his complete control. A few days later, Ellie the stable girl arrived. She was quiet, efficient, and utterly unremarkable. She kept her head down and her eyes open. The staff, remembering the kind Duchess Elara, were suspicious at first, but her genuine skill with the horses and her lack of pretense soon won them over. She moved through the cavernous manor like a ghost, invisible to the gentry, but a confidant to the maids and footmen. She heard the whispers. She learned of Frederick's late-night card games, of the men he owed money to, of his sneering comments about the Duke's weak son. She pieced together the web of his deceit, thread by ugly thread. Meanwhile, she continued her work with Thomas. Away from the prying eyes of the court, in a secluded paddock, she and the boy rekindled their bond. He was soon riding Daisy with confidence, his laughter echoing in the crisp autumn air. Alistair would watch from the window of his study, his heart aching with a mixture of hope and sorrow. He saw his son healing, he saw his wife, strong and resilient, fighting for them in the shadows. The trap was set for the annual Blackwood Harvest Ball, the grandest social event of the season. The ballroom was a sea of glittering jewels and rustling silk. Frederick was in his element, preening and accepting compliments on his steadfast support of his bereaved cousin. Alistair stood at the head of the grand staircase, looking down at the crowd. He caught Elara's eye. She was standing in the shadows of the gallery, dressed in a simple servant's gown, but she held herself like a queen. She gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Alistair descended the stairs, a hush falling over the room. He did not look defeated. He looked regal, powerful, his face set like granite. He walked directly to his cousin. "Frederick," he said, his voice carrying through the silent ballroom, "I believe you have some debts to attend to." On cue, two grim-faced men, bailiffs Alistair had brought from London, stepped forward. At the same time, Alistair's solicitor began handing out copies of a small, neatly printed document to the most influential guests. It was the stable hand's confession. Frederick went pale. "Alistair, what is the meaning of this? Have you gone mad?" "On the contrary," Alistair said, his voice cold as ice, "I have finally come to my senses. You deliberately injured my son. You framed my wife. You have been feeding on my grief like a vulture for 5 years." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Frederick looked around wildly, his eyes searching for an ally but finding only shocked and accusing faces. "It is a lie," he sputtered. "The man is delusional." "Is it?" a clear voice called from the gallery. All heads turned. Ilara stepped out of the shadows. She had shed the servant's drab dress. She was wearing a simple but elegant gown of deep forest green that one of the loyal maids had helped her find. Around her neck was not the famous Blackwood diamond necklace, but a simple silver chain. Hanging from it was a small, worn locket. She descended the staircase, and the crowd parted before her as if she were Moses parting the Red Sea. She was not the ghost of the Duchess of Blackwood. She was a resurrection. She stopped beside Alistair. She did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on Frederick, and they burned with a cold, righteous fury. "Hello, Frederick," she said, her voice ringing with an authority no one had heard in 5 years. "Do you remember me?" Frederick stared, his mouth agape, his face a mask of pure horror. You are dead." "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," she said with a wry, dangerous smile, "as are reports of my infidelity." She held up the locket. "But the reports of your cruelty, it seems, were all too true." It was over. Frederick's ruin was total, spectacular, and absolute. He was dragged away in disgrace, his social and financial world collapsing around him in a single, catastrophic evening. Later that night, the great house was quiet. The guests were gone, the whispers faded. Alistair found Ilara in the nursery, standing over their sleeping son. Thomas was curled on his side, his face peaceful, his hand resting on the pillow, open and relaxed. "He looks like you when he sleeps," Alistair said softly from the doorway. "He has your courage," she replied, not turning around. "He just needed to be shown how to find it." Alistair walked into the room, stopping beside her. The space between them was no longer a chasm of anger, but a quiet space of shared victory and tentative hope. "I do not expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Not tonight, maybe not ever. But I am asking for a chance to earn it, to start again, not as we were, but as we could be, as partners, as Thomas's parents." She finally turned to face him. In the soft lamplight, she looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the humility that had replaced his pride. She saw the man who had stood by her, who had trusted her plan, who had fought for their family. She reached up and touched the locket at her throat. "When I fled," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I lost the child I was carrying, a little girl. I mourned her, and I mourned Thomas, and I mourned the life we were supposed to have." Alistair's face crumpled with a fresh wave of pain. He had not known. Another life lost to his foolishness. "Ilara, But tonight," she interrupted gently, "standing on that staircase, I was not mourning. I was fighting. You have given me back my son. You have given me back my name. And you have given me back my strength." She took a deep breath. "A new beginning is a rare gift, Alistair. It would be foolish to waste it." She did not say she forgave him. She did not need to. Forgiveness was not a word. It was an action. And this choice to stay, to rebuild, was the beginning of it. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were calloused from her work, but they fit in his as perfectly as they always had. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. "The harvest is in," he said softly, a nod to the ball that had changed everything. "Yes," she agreed, a small, true smile finally reaching her eyes. "It is." The following spring, the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood were often seen riding out together. They were not alone. Between them, on a sturdy brown pony, rode their son, his laughter bright and free. They were not the same people they had been. Their gilded cage had been broken, its pieces reforged into something stronger, truer. They were a family, built not on duty or expectation, but on the hard-won, beautiful foundation of earned forgiveness and a love that had, against all odds, survived the fire.